without further ado, I'll let David, give himself a better introduction than I could do, and he's going to talk a little bit about what he's developed some expertise in now is designing for cognitive bias. So David, good morning, welcome, thank you.
Thanks for having me, and thank you all for coming out so early, especially on the West Coast. And yeah, the movie that Mike was referring to is called Developing Philly. I've put the link in the chat if you want to check it out and see his talking head scenes dispersed throughout. He had some great things to say about the Philly tech scene. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Oh, Mike, can you allow me to share my screen?
I can. There you go.
And we'll get started. So thank you all for coming out today. Today we're going to talk about design for cognitive bias using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. We can certainly talk about how to use them for evil, but I feel like most of us have a good sense of that so far. My name is David Dillon Thomas, and I am content strategy advocate at Think Company. It's an experienced design firm. And I wrote a book called Design for Cognitive Bias, which is going to be a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And the road to this book started with a podcast I used to do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. I resurrected it recently to market for the book. In fact, we're doing an episode tomorrow with another entrepreneur, Alex Hillman. We'll actually be talking about entrepreneurship, so you might want to check that out. But to get to this podcast, it all began with this woman here. Her name is Iris Bonnet, and she did a talk called Gender Equality by Design. And her basic premise was that a lot of the implicit bias we see comes back to pattern recognition. So let's say you're hiring a web developer, and the image that pops into your head the second I say web developer might be skinny white dude. And that's not because you ardently believe that men are better programmers than women, far from it. But the pattern that you may have seen throughout your life in offices, movies, television, is that white dude equals web developer. So if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit that, without even realizing it, you start to give that resume the side eye. And when I saw that something as pernicious as racial bias, gender bias, could come back to something as simple, dare I say human, as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so that's what I did. This is the Rational Wiki page for cognitive biases. There's well over 100 here, and I figured I am not going to figure this out in one day. So I took one a day. And I learned about it. Next day, moved on to the next one. And this inevitably turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so eventually my friends were like, Dave, please just get a podcast. Now, from the jump, we should probably establish what is cognitive bias. And at the end of the day, it's a series of shortcuts your mind is making just to get through the day. You have to make something like 8 trillion decisions a day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about how fast to talk or where to look or what to do with my hands. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that for the most part, our lives are on autopilot, but sometimes the autopilot gets it wrong. And when it does, we call those cognitive biases. So here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it plays out when you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a high number, odds are you're going to roll that die really hard. If you need a low number, odds are you're going to roll that die really gently. And it makes absolutely no difference how hard you roll the die, but we like to think we have control in situations where we have no control. And so we embody that by how hard we throw the die. This one is not so harmless. It's called confirmation bias. And it plays out when you have an idea in your head you just can't shake. And you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you ever see evidence that does not support the idea, you say fake news and you move on. Very powerful example came during the Iraq War. The whole idea was we need to go in there because Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We got to get him before he gets us. As it turns out, not so much with weapons of mass destruction. And within a year, the president of the United States, who had insisted there were weapons of mass destruction there, said, yeah, we didn't really find anything. But that didn't stop people from believing there were weapons of mass destruction there. In fact, even by 2015, 50% of Republicans believed that, yeah, there were weapons of mass destruction there, and 36% of Democrats. So this is an extremely powerful bias, and we are going to come back to it. Now, these are really difficult to fight. Part of the problem is you may not even realize you have the bias. In fact, there's literally a bias called the bias blind spot where you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure everybody else does. Part of the problem spotting them is that about 95% of cognition happens below the conscious level. you are making decisions constantly and so fast that you don't even realize you're making them. In fact, the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, odds are you're going to commit it anyway. There is a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could say to everybody on this call, write down the last 2 numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, okay, we're going to bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down a lower number are going to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down a higher number are going to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. Here's the thing. I could start that experiment and explicitly tell you, hey, there's this thing called anchoring. It's going to make you do something stupid. Don't do it. Still do it. In fact, I could start the experiment by saying, hey, there's this thing called anchoring. It's going to make you do something stupid. I will pay you cash money not to do it. Odds are you'll still do it. The good news is that there are content and design choices we can make to keep some of these biases at bay, or sometimes use them for good. Let's go back to the skinny white guy. Now, as it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have 2 identical resumes, and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it's a male name, it'll move up the pile. If it's a female name, stays on the pile. Thing is, why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you decide who to hire? Think of it like a signal-to-noise problem. The signal, the things that are actually going to help you make the decision, are things like qualifications, experience. The thing that might actually get in the way, gender, race, or whatever you're reading into the name in terms of gender and race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of blind hiring for a web developer position, and they discovered a couple of things. One is, even in the high-tech world of web development, the best way to anonymize a resume is to physically print it out, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document before you pass it on to the hiring people. The other thing they realized is, once they found a resume they liked, the next step would be to go to GitHub, a code repository, to see that developer's portfolio. The problem is, the second they got to GitHub, all the personal information for that developer would be there. So clever people that they are, they wrote a Chrome plugin that would anonymize all of that information as the page loaded. And just to complete the circle, they took that code, put it back on GitHub, and it's there right now if you want to try this yourself. Another really important phenomenon to be aware of is called cognitive fluency. And it's this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, we assume whatever it's talking about, it's also going to be easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, we'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's going to be hard to do. Now, this is a recipe for pancakes. I've been making a lot of pancakes lately. Love pancakes. This is a recipe for pancakes, and the text is kind of small, clumped together. I take a glance at that and I think, I bet pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now, you can put that same text into a, nice wide format imagery and small little bursts of text, and I glance at that. And before I've read a word, I might say, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. I think I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget it, we're making pancakes. Now, let's put this in the world of public transportation, right? I'm trying to decide if I want to go from Media, Pennsylvania, where I am now, to downtown Philadelphia, right? And am I going to take public transportation or am I going to drive? I take one look at that printed schedule and I think, oh my God, public transportation is impossible. I'm going to drive. I take a look at that app screen. And again, before I've read a word, I think, you know what? I bet public transportation isn't that hard. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Now, I can't see all your faces right now, but I want you to go ahead and vote. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? All right, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913, but most people usually go for 1914. And the reason is, if something's easier to read, we actually think it's more true, but it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true, and this has consequences. Now, what's happening is that we like things that are easy to process. Things that are easy to process give us certainty. I'll give you an example. If I were to ask you, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You might not be very sure. It's hard to remember. If I were to say, well, you got a toy truck, right? You might say, I don't know. I don't feel very certain about that answer. It's hard to remember. It's hard to process. It doesn't feel certain. If I were to ask you, what did you have for dinner last night? Okay, you'd have a pretty clear idea, right? It feels pretty certain. It's easy to remember. It's easy to process. It feels more certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember. They feel more certain. Things that have clear fonts are easy to read, big, bold text, easier to process, feel more certain. Now, this This becomes important when it comes to things that we need to believe. There is a crisis in this country where, generally speaking, African Americans do not believe health information that comes from the government. In 2002, when responding to the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African Americans agreed with the statement. By the time we get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other Bootstrappers Breakfast about why there are legit reasons African Americans have concerns about health information coming from the government, but truth is, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language, if it needs to have big pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor kind of challenged me and said, okay, this is interesting, but can you actually point to examples where plain language and pictograms have saved lives? And I'm glad she pushed me on it because it forced me to do the work, and I found some really interesting examples. So here we have women who are smoking while pregnant. And when they are presented materials at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they were more likely to achieve abstinence during pregnancy and 6 weeks postpartum, right, and stop smoking. Similarly, you have people who are caregivers, right, providing medicine for people. When they had a plain language pictogram-based intervention, we saw decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence, right? Adherence is a huge issue in the medical community. Even if you can get the person the drugs, the odds of them actually taking them and taking the right doses aren't always that high. Now, you might say, okay, that's great and all for pictograms and plain language, but rhyming, Dave, really? Can rhyming save lives? Let me introduce you to Click It or Ticket. So not too long ago, a bunch of states rolled out laws that said if you don't wear your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. Now the law all on its own did pretty good, right? Especially among older drivers, it increased seatbelt use, but not as much among younger drivers. So they rolled out Click It or Ticket, and the results were that national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. And just to put that in human terms, every percentage point you go up in people buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So if you do the rough math, it's about 4,000 lives saved just, in part through rhyming. It's silly, but it works. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world, for my money, is the framing effect. And it starts out pretty innocently. Let's say you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean. Right next to it, there's a sign that says beef 5% fat. Now, which one do you think people are going to line up for? It's the same thing, but I've just framed one in a way that seems more attractive. Now, this is all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? You see what I did there? We're no longer discussing whether war is a good idea in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, if you are multilingual, you have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you're less likely to fall for the scam. Now, I speak a little bit of French, so if I were to think about the beef decision in French, it would go something like, let's see, beef, that's bœuf, that's a lot of vowels, 95%, okay, 89, maybe, right? And by the time I've done all that processing, I see right through the scam. And that's what thinking in your non-primary language is doing. It's slowing down your thinking. And if you can slow down your thinking, you're generally not going to fall for a lot of these things. Now, it is possible to use the framing effect for good. There's an experiment where you have a photo like this and you show it to an audience and you ask them, should this person drive this car? And what you'll get is a policy discussion, right? And you'll have some people saying, old people are bad at everything, don't let them drive. And you'll have other people saying, that's ageist, how dare you, let people do what they want. All you're gonna learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now you could show the exact same photo to another audience and ask them, how might this person drive this car? What you'll get is a design discussion. And some people will say, well, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we move the dashboard? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. In fact, if we iris out a little more and ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why the guy was in the car in the first place, because he was here, but he wanted to be there. Now things like public transportation are on the table. The point is, all I did was change a little bit of the question, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I have changed the entire conversation. I want to close by talking about our own biases, because these are the ones that can really get people in trouble. Told you we'd come back to this. So for a long time, I had a complete misunderstanding of what the scientific method was. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. And if I like the result, I'll write down what I did, and a whole bunch of other people will try it. And if they get the same result, great, that's a win. Write it down, it's a law, move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated than that. So I have an idea about how the world works. I try something to see if I'm right. And if I am, I write down what I did, and a whole bunch of other people try the same thing. And if they get the same result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else could be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that, which is a much more rigorous approach and was designed specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as people who make things, as people who own businesses, it's very easy for us to fall in love with an initial idea and leave a much better idea on the table. Let me show you how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with a computer, and the computer's going to show us these numbers and that question mark and say, put whatever number you want where that question mark is. I will tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. If you're like me, you start out by trying 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, hold my beer, I've got this. The answer is, the pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I didn't try this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is that every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution. Probably easier to code, probably cheaper to build. But I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are ways to avoid this outcome. One of them is called red team, blue team. And it's this idea that you have a blue team who's going to do the initial research, initial design, maybe get as far as a wireframe or basic product idea. But before they go any further, the red team is going to come in for one day. And the red team's job is to go to war with the blue team. And they're there to find every little hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team never saw because they were so in love with their first idea. Now, I like this approach because it's fairly economical. I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, every time we do a project now, we got to spin up 2 teams who check each other's work every day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely we're going to put something harmful out into the world. Another tool we can use for this is called speculative design. And it's very much like that show Black Mirror. And if you've never seen Black Mirror, it's an anthology show where you basically take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if real human beings got their hands on it. And it's always terrible. In fact, I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. This is a real job. Superflex went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them figure out the future of energy. And the question on the table was, do we continue down the path of fossil fuels or do we start investing in renewables? One of the things Superflex did was to figure out, okay, what's your air quality going to be like 5, 10, 15 years out if you stay on the path of fossil fuels? But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it. And then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to about 10 years out, it is unbreathable. So by the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest $150 billion in renewables. Another thing you can do that I think is kind of interesting to get all your biases on the table at the beginning of a project is an assumption audit. And you basically get your team in a room and you have everyone answer these questions. What identities does your team represent? And you only self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you consider different intersectionalities, right? Gender, age, income, neurodiversity, right? Just get that all on the table. And then ask, how might those identities influence the design of this thing we're making? Then you ask, who isn't in the room, right? Whose identities are not represented? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here ever had their immigration status questioned? Then you ask, how might the absence of those folks influence the outcome of this thing we're working on? And finally, you ask, what might we do as a team to include, honor, and give power to those perspectives in your design process? The final bias I want to talk about is called the Defaultion Professional. Told you I speak French. And it's this idea that we see the whole world through the lens of our job, which in the workaholic world we live in might seem like a good idea, right up until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road probably thought they were doing a good job. Technically speaking, they were. They were getting very difficult to get photographs that were going to fetch them a very high price. What they weren't necessarily doing such a good job at was being human beings. Now, when the former police commissioner of Philadelphia took the job, he said to his officers, he asked them, "What do you think your job is?" And many of them said to enforce the law. And he said, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I were to tell you your job is to protect civil rights? That's a much bigger job, right? It encompasses enforcing the law, but it also forces you to treat people with dignity. Now, I've had this slide in here since 2017, and obviously the impact of it has become far more visible in the past few months. And I get even more emotional than I used to when we get to this slide, but I've left it in here because now more than ever, it is clear how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. And what Officer Ramsey was telling his officers that day was, your jobs are harder than you think. And I will submit that our jobs are harder than we think. It's not just build cool shit. We have to find a way to define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, people are already working on this. In the design world, you have Mike Montero's design ethics, which is basically a Hippocratic oath for designers, a first do no harm. You have the Design Justice Network, which is doing amazing work in this arena. And they have this list of 10 principles. I just want to read you the first two. 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, if you just try to stick to those first two, you've got your work cut out for you. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. And often we think we're doing the former when we're actually doing is the latter. Another great intervention here is called the tarot cards of tech. And you go to the site and there are these cards and you click on them and they flip around and they give you these really provocative questions about the design of your product. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? Now, if Twitter had asked itself before they launched, we might see a different world today. We're seeing software engineers begin to get on this as well. So there's the Never Again Pledge, which a bunch of data engineers got together and signed when they saw that their work was being used to harm vulnerable communities like immigrants. And they pointed to a very long and sordid history of data being used to hurt and marginalize people. And they said, we don't want to be a part of that. And you're seeing this kind of collective action play out in places like Google, where you had Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And software engineers at Google said, hey, look, I didn't get into this business to build weapons. If you make us work on this, we're going to walk. And Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million military contract and then turned right around to Dragonfly, which is censored search in China. So this fight is still going on. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this isn't some software guru at a TED Talk. This is Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, he saw this, and it's only more true today. So the question I will leave all of us with is, how can we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Super. Dave, that was great. And I know you try to fit a lot in a very short period of time. And I'm going to go try to figure out how we can get everyone back now. Okay, so I think I don't have your video spotlighted now, and we've got, you can do gallery view if you want, and love to get started on some Q&A for David. And we're going to do this unfacilitated. So if for some reason a particular topic is too narrow or too or goes on too long, I may take it offline afterwards, but for after later discussion later. But let's go. Do we have questions for David?
I just wanted to say thank you for this powerful message, and I actually learned a lot from you. So I really just being super thankful for this meeting. It's my first time being here. But I also wanted to know if it would be possible to share this video whenever it gets posted, wherever. That would be super kind. So I could go back to a lot of things that you were talking about, so I could do my own research and learn on my own.
Mike, I mean, I'm cool with it. Mike, are you?
Yeah, we typically, we typically will take this recording, put it up on YouTube, get the speaker's permission once they see what they said, just to make sure that they want it publicized. And I'm sure, David, in this case, you
Yep.
will. Yeah, so our typical behavior is to share the video, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And anybody wants to follow up, I'm posting my website in here. You can find the book there, book me to speak a gig, or just, set up a coffee chat if you want, using that link.
That'd be super, super helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
David, you've probably also done podcasts where you've spent more time and got a little bit deeper. So there's probably some of this online in addition to what we're discussing today. Yeah,
there's the book. There's my podcast, which I did for like 3 years, called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. It's less about tech, but it is get into all these biases. And like I said, I've resurrected that podcast. So I'm doing a bunch of live events this fall.
Questions, David?
I got a question. David, thanks for the talk. Kind of got me thinking a little bit when you were talking about how to design the products and things we use around that person that's going to be impacted for it, or the group that's going to be impacted, which kind of reminds me of a quote I've heard 1,000 times about if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, and how it's like an entire media model that's been built that is designed to promote shareholder value and not necessarily like directly help the user out. How do you like approach that as like a whole, maybe a philosophical level? Because that's kind of tied up in how we do business today, especially from like how you design products, but also how investors look at products, because you can't fit that model, they get scared because that's what they know.
Yeah, and I'm glad you put it the way like because that's what they know, and I think that's one of the like. I could approach this from the whole, unfortunately, as you know, capitalism approach, right? Which is sort of like shareholder value. Well, that's the whole point. But, and that kind of presumes a certain level of greed, which I think exists, but I don't think it's like, I think it's as much what you're kind of saying of like, well, that's just the way we do it, right? Like we're supposed to get 10X, right? That's how we come up with a business plan, and the impact we need to think about with the business plan is, the value and shareholder value, and are people going to pay for this, and how many, and enough to cover my costs, blah, 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 blah. Which, yeah, if you don't do those things, the business won't work. But there's this other level of, social impact. And the idea is that if we run our businesses in a way where all we think about is shareholder value, and all we think about is, lying, and even if all we think about is customer value, right? Because if you think about it, Walmart is great customer value, right? Walmart makes it really easy to get milk. But all this other stuff comes with it if that's your only goal, right? So I think if we, say, okay, look, I know you're thinking about a lot, but there's one other level I really want you to think about, and that's the social impact, right? Is there a way that you can run your business in a way that's actually going to help society? Studies have shown that kind of approach, which doesn't look to maximize like the gap between, say, what the CEO is paid and what the entry-level person is paid, those businesses tend to perform better and last longer, right? So there's that, like, again, purely monetary benefit, but also it's just sort of like, businesses exist, but businesses exist in a society, right? Like we're not like off on a moon somewhere, like running our thing and like putting stuff into a computer and getting money out. No, we're all here together. So if we can run a business in a way that makes that easier, right? So much the better. And honestly, the lift isn't that much harder. More often than not, what it is if you're a company making, $5 billion a year, it's like, yeah, can you get away with 4 billion? Right? You're starting to get to points where it's sort of like, okay, at this point, you're just arguing about profit margin. You're no longer like, oh, I can't sustain my business if I, pay my laborers a fair wage. Like once you get to that scale, it's like, no, you could pay people what you want. You just wouldn't make as many money for your shareholders. Does that answer the question? I feel like I went off on a tangent.
Yeah, it answers it, I think, in a certain way. It's getting that mindset through to the businesses, because, just going from 5 to 4 billion, there's so many strings attached to that number that even though it's still like crazy money, it's going to collapse what their prospectus was and all that stuff that people started investing with.
Right, and that I think, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
No, I was just saying that honestly, and now you're actually talking about systemic change, right? Because literally the legal definition of different kinds of businesses, right, will force that issue, right? Like there's certain legal definitions that mean, no, I can't focus on social impact. I'm in default if I don't focus on shareholder value, right? Like that, I signed a contract to maximize shareholder value. So I legally can't think about social impact. But then there are other legal structures that say, no, you're going to write a charter and you're going to be legally bound to support the charter as well as shareholder impact. So I think, again, going back to well, this is how we always do it, right? Things like B Corps were created to say, well, let's give you some other options so that the default isn't, oh, I got to maximize shareholder value. I can give you some other potential defaults that still make money. So I think, but I agree. Like if you've signed a contract to do things a certain way, now your hands are kind of tied. So to me, it's like you need to take a step even further back before you sign that contract to say, well, is there a different contract?
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, that's kind of what I'm getting at. Like, what is that contract, and how do you find people that are willing to back companies that may have a different model that's maybe not as proven that yields better social results?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll tell you what I've seen, right? So there's one version of the world which this is going to be totally antithetical for a bootstrap. Well, not actually for a bootstrap perspective, not necessarily, but there's a totally other model that's sort of saying like, my goal is not to get venture capital in the first place. My goal is to simply bootstrap my business and make it a sustainable business, which now you're not beholden, because the second you take VC, right, now you're beholden, you have two masters, your customer and your funder, right? And if you have to make a decision where this will make my funder happy, but it will not make my customer happy and it will not make society happy, guess what? You gotta serve the funder, right? Because you signed that contract. So there's that area of, do you need to take that money in the first place? Now, if you do, then yeah, you have to start looking at people who are interested in social impact from the jump. And there are plenty of organizations now that focus on social impact companies, right? Like that is a form of venture capital now that people are out there looking for. There are even stocks where I can choose to invest my portfolio in socially conscious companies, right? Like that is a class of company now that are taking money with certain caveats of, if you are like this, if you can hit these benchmarks or criteria or whatever, okay, you fall into that class of companies that I can invest in. So even at the public company level, right, there are people trying to think about ways to say, we value more than just profit. We value this impact, that impact. I think it's still young, like maybe 20 years young. I don't think the B Corp is more than 20 years old at this point. There's also public benefit companies. You can see what Kickstarter did when they shifted from being a for-profit to a for-benefit, which isn't perfect, right? Like they're union busting. But on the other hand, they have some really great, moves around salary transparency and diversity. So I'd say it's early days yet. And that's why, yeah, it's going to be a challenge to find people who are interested in that. But there were already structures in place to make that looking a little easier.
David, I know that your focus has been on design, your background is in content, but I thought maybe I could ask you a little bit about your thoughts about hiring and recruiting. That's, you gave the City of Philadelphia as example, but I'll say that that's one of the first challenges that a bootstrapping entrepreneur, an organically grown company has is those first hires. And any insights on our doing it better, trying to eliminate bias from our own in our small companies, eliminating bias.
Yeah, and then the hallmark of any company starting, getting their first 5 employees is you are strapped for time, you're strapped for money, right? At the same time, understand that those first 5 hires are going to color the culture of your company for decades. And whatever biases you do or don't bring to the table are going to influence. So I can give you an example. I work for a company where they have a very good sense of work-life balance. And the reason they have a very good sense of work-life balance is because literally the people who founded the company founded it in part because they were sick of working 80-hour work weeks. And they said, we're going to make something different. And they did, right? And so all the people who were there at the beginning, right, at the same time, and they'll tell you this, with a straight face, like, yeah, they realize that most of the senior leadership by far is, middle-aged white dudes, because the people who founded the company were middle-aged white dudes, right? And they hired people they knew, which you generally know people who are like you, and that's who you hire. And that's a choice you're going to have to make, right? It is going to be more difficult, right? There's going to be 2 challenges in hiring people who aren't like you. One is finding them, because odds are you don't know people who aren't like you. That's just the human condition. Unless you've actively sought to diversify your network, that's the way it's going to be. And 2, trust, right? The people you trust are the people you've known for a while. Most people hire people they know in that first 4 or 5 hires, right? It's my partner. It's the guy I've been co-working with. It's like, and we had a lunch and said, we should start a business. Yeah, dude, let's start a business. Okay, they're your first 2 hires, right? And the odds are those are people who look like you. So what I think the opportunity is to say, okay, is the best outcome going to come from hiring people I know, or is the best outcome going to come from hiring people who have the skill set to make this particular product a success? Which forces you to answer the question, okay, well, what are the actual skill sets that make this product a success? I think the amazing thing about doing an anonymized hiring is it forces you to focus on value. What is the actual value this person brings to the table? Not what am I comfortable with, right? Screw what I'm comfortable with. What actually brings value here, which means I have to define, is it actually about the code? Is that the thing you need? Is it about being able to think outside the box? Is that what I need? Is it about a network? Maybe I'm the first person I'm hiring as a salesperson. Maybe the network is the thing that most, but it forces you to focus on that first and not comfort, because comfort is the thing that's going to give you a monoculture, right? If I'm just going to hire people I'm comfortable with, I'm generally going to hire people who think like me, who work like me, who make as much money as me, who live in similar neighborhoods to me, right? So I think that's the challenge you have to sort of decide on and those early stages is, you know, and it's a spectrum. Am I going to veer more towards comfort, or am I going to veer more towards like doing the hard work of figuring out, well, what do I actually need to get this thing to launch? And then how do I, if it turns out to be this quality, well, how can I find that quality, right? In a way that isn't going to be distracted by their first name or what college they went to or any other thing where I'm like, oh, Harvard, that makes me feel secure. Let's go with Harvard. It's like, dude, George W. Bush and Barack Obama both went to Harvard. You cannot find two more different candidates for the same job. So it is 100% a challenge, but I think that is the challenge, is that comfort versus skill piece.
Thank you.
David, I have a follow-up to that question. Kind of on the other end of the spectrum, outside of like getting outside of your comfort zone as far as hiring goes. How do you feel about kind of forcing diversity in your company? Like specifically hiring people who don't have the same race or background as you do, and kind of favoring them over, because of those qualities rather than the values that they're bringing to the table, so to speak. It's definitely been a kind of a touchy conversation at our company.
Absolutely. So it's funny you mentioned that. I was actually talking to a nonprofit in Australia that we were having that same discussion. And it's funny you use the word values there, because one of their values, like they'd done the work to sort of say, these are our core values. One of their core values is like diversity is, it was like mandatory or something like, or foundational, like it is necessary. Diversity is necessary, which meant that if they in fact had two equally qualified people and one of them had the same background and the same experience and the same lived experience and the same intersectionalities as 5 other people on the team, and someone else was qualified but had completely different backgrounds, they're going to hire the person with a different background. And when someone asks why they did that, they're going to point to, it says right here, diversity is necessary. Like we will fail if we don't have diversity, right? That's how important it is to them. So if you've made the decision as a company that this is it, like this is our bleeding edge, this is actually why we do better. And in fact, here's study after study to show that more diverse teams get better results, right? So that's one way to think of it. Another way I like to think of it is, if you imagine you're putting together like a superhero team, like the Avengers, why would you want 5 Iron Men? No, I get different people. Like if I have Iron Man and you show up in your Iron Man, it's like, that's great, but we already have that slot filled. Get me Black Panther, right? Like, so that's the other way I think about it. It's like, it's not like a quota system so much as it is, well, we already have that tool in our tool set. I need a new tool, right? And the other thing I really want to stress here, especially since I'm talking to entrepreneurs, is this notion of culture fit. So we think about culture fit as a good thing, especially if we like our culture. But the only problem with that is that can very easily turn into a monoculture. And the phrase that I've heard that I like a lot better is culture growth, right? Hire for culture growth. So it's not just, hey, I'm going to hire you based on how comfortable you make me feel or how seamlessly you fit in with everything here, right? Or, hey, you look different, but you seem like enough of a fit where if you get here, you'll assimilate, right? You'll become like us, which is how you end up losing half of your diversity hires in the first place. A lot of people come to these companies like, there's no room for me here, I'm leaving. Instead, you say, no, I'm going to hire you specifically because you're different from us, and specifically because I think you can help us grow, because our company is not a stone. Our company is constantly evolving. It is constantly growing, and we think you'll take it in the right direction. And if you do it that way, when they come into the company, they will be given some degree of control over saying, you're here to change us, not you're here to be exactly like us. So I think all of those factors can give you a framework to make it easier to have those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, thanks. That helps a lot. One other point was the other side of the argument I've heard is that people can perceive it as maybe condescending if they are being chosen specifically, like just because they're different, or they perceive that that's the case. Is there a strategy for alleviating that kind of sentiment?
I mean, if that's, I would say just be honest. And again, be honest. Like if in fact you've decided as a company that diversity is strength, and yes, we have no Black people here and we're hiring you because you're Black. That is part of the reason, because we believe diversity is necessary. And if you don't agree with us, fine. Like I don't want you here if you don't agree with us. Like that's sort of the thing. It's like the things you need to align with are the values of the company, like whoever you're hiring. Like that's necessary. That is going to be like solid. But the expression of those values, that's the thing that needs to be able to grow. And you want to be able to be honest with that person and say, look, part of the reason we want you here is because we want to grow. We want to be different. We want to be more diverse. And if they're like, I don't want that role. I don't want to take on that responsibility. Great. Yeah. You need to find somebody else.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you for your insight. It was really helpful.
Thanks, John. Any other questions for David?
Oh, I wanted to say, so David, I live in Toronto, and I would say that employers in Toronto to some extent follow what you are basically suggesting. In other words, Toronto is an extremely multicultural city, and many employers do see it as a big advantage to have people from different parts of the world or different cultural backgrounds or different genders, et cetera. And, there have been some successes, but if I look at America and I look at American business and I look at American entrepreneurial business, I mean, you seem to be saying that rationality is the key here. And that if we look at the evidence, if we look at studies, then we'll see that this sort of policy will be more successful, maybe than what we're doing now. But like American business doesn't strike me as working that way. And frankly, America doesn't strike me as working that way. It's not rational. America was not a kind of a rational project. It was a leap of faith. Like people, traveled and set up in very rough settlements, on the East Coast, and had some very rough times. And a lot of people never thought that would actually work. And so leaps of faith, including, companies like Apple or even Amazon, were regarded as very rash and not really rational. So how do you respond to that idea?
So first of all, nobody is rational. If you're doing 95% of your decision-making below the threshold of conscious thought, it is physically impossible to be rational. Right now, what we are very good at is rationalizing, right? Our brain is not only good at making those decisions without bringing in your conscious level to, consult, it's also very good at telling your conscious level, oh yeah, no, you totally decided that. Like our brains are these excellent deception machines, like self-deception machines. So I would argue nobody's rational. Somebody's sort of come off better at it and able to I would say, take more pro-social approaches and, usually stemming from the culture. But now America's version of irrationality, I think, is very, capitalist minded. But the fact of the matter is, dear departed Ruth Bader Ginsburg once said that the national symbol is the eagle, but it should be the pendulum. Like America is a lot of ways, right? There was a time in this country where you had a company like A&P who was monopolistically rolling up into towns, underselling all of the other grocers, driving them out of business. And once they were out of business, jacking the prices back up because they were the only game in town. They got shut down because that was illegal. Today, a Walmart can do the same thing and get a tax break, right? So America's a lot of ways, right? Like we go back and forth with how we do things. I mean, look at the Obama administration, look at the current administration, and that's just over the course of 16 years, right? So like we're a lot of ways. So basically I think that there are people in this country, and again, there's a pattern where one American myth is you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you don't succeed, that's on you. And we don't need to provide any support whatsoever, right? And it's everyone for themselves. That is definitely a strain that has played out throughout American history and is very, let's say, high right now, right? There's also a strain of American history that's like, the whole point we came here is because we had people, we had systems that were telling us what to do. And we're making it so that who your parents are decide the course of your entire life. And we left because we'd had enough of that. So we're going to create a society where who your parents are doesn't mean anything, right? And we're going to support each other, right? And we're going to form communities, right? It's a completely different strain. And we've seen that play out, right? In several different movements. So there's a version of American business which is about value. It's about actually providing value to people in a way that isn't trying to screw them over, right? Mm-hmm. So again, we've seen anti-monopolistic America and monopolistic America. And the things I'm really advocating for, or is veering more toward the pro-social version of that. Weirdly, the closest you can get to the kinds of things I'm talking about is the military. The military has perfect salary transparency. If I know what your rank is, I know exactly how much money you make. And it can't be higher, and you don't get to negotiate it later, right? Right. They have socialized healthcare, socialized housing, so like it is almost as a socialist utopia, right? And it's funny too, like I was talking to a psychologist who used to work for the military, and she was saying, look, if you're a Black woman who wants mobility, join the military. Like you will find no fairer hiring ground than the military, right? So there's versions of America where and this is not to say that the military is perfect, they have a horrible, record in terms of sexism and violence, but sexual violence. But the idea is that when we want to, we can make a perfectly socialist system, right? We can subsidize. We decided football was going to be a thing and made it a multi-billion-dollar industry. There was a time in this country when nobody knew what the hell football was. We just decided one day to do it. So I get the long story short is that yes, there are certain approaches that American companies have taken that have been super irrational. And so would that work in America? And the problem is, and I get that, but the problem is that just about everything has worked in America. You can point, because we're so diverse, you can point to any particular strain of thought around how to do a business. And I can give you 5 or 6 examples of, there are perfectly successful businesses that have taken this super pro-social, almost communist approach to how they do things, and they're making millions of dollars every year.
Yeah, okay, well put, thanks.
I have a quick question. I'm curious to hear about your experience when you were writing the book and researching and reading what biases you had as you went into the book, and which ones did you have to move away from, break down, and like sort of unlearn or learn in a new way?
Yeah, but I learned more than anything else is that my memory is crap. And this is a concept that I talk about in the book, and if you study cognitive bias, you'll find out very quickly, our memories are horrible. So we have this notion that our memories are like these perfect recording machines, like the security camera in a convenience store, and it captures everything. And if you could only just remember, you would see it perfectly. The truth is your memory is more like one of those true crime stories where it's like you have actors reenact the crime, except they're all drunk and they forget their lines and they do it differently every single time. That's human memory. And so I would have these examples where I'm like, oh my God, I have this great study I'm going to write about where this thing happened. It was amazing. And then I'll be like, oh, I should find out, I need some facts on that. Let me go find out about the study. And I'll find out, oh no, I took 2 completely different studies that I heard about at 2 completely different times and conflated them in my mind to make this new study that doesn't actually exist, right? That happened all the time when I was fact checking the book. I'm like, oh yeah, that didn't really happen. I should stop telling that story. So there was a lot of that. I've learned that, my own memory is not nearly as and that's why we have fact checkers, right? Like even when you sincerely want to tell the truth, I'm not trying to fool you, right? My memory is crap. So that was honestly one of the biggest biases I ran into, is that my memory is not nearly as good as I think it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Sure.
So we are going to,
I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Conversation, like our typical Bootstrappers discussion, but David, this has been incredible. I want to thank you for all your insights and your time. There's contact information, I'm sure, in chat, but we'll follow up with, when we follow up with a link to the video, we'll include your website and contact information as well. Any further thoughts? Like one thing you want us to take away, what might it be?
What I usually tell people is just get really good at listening. That's a skill that's, set me up. A guy named Alex Selman gave me this piece of advice once, said it's impossible to listen and react at the same time. And I found that to be super helpful if I'm talking to somebody and they start talking and I'm like, oh, I got a great story about that. I can't wait till they shut up so I can tell my story. It's like, okay, I'm no longer listening. So I try to actively listen. And when you do, A, people like you more because they actually get heard, but then B, you actually get the information you need and the connection you need. So just get good at listening.
Excellent. And as a coach, that's what I get paid to do. So
There you go.
thank you for that endorsement. Super. Well, everyone, I want you to thank David. The feedback in the chat room, and I'm sure the feedback we'll get afterwards is super. So Dave, we really appreciate it. And we're gonna jump into. I'm gonna stop the recording. Hang on.